1 week ago, Israel, obviously, everyone knows, had a tremendous shock and sorrow. And by Klal Yisrael, when things happen, we look to try to nis'oyer ourselves to tshuva and ma'asim tovim, and to try to understand that, to see the Darkei Hashem, to see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is speaking with us, and we have to use it. I use these mu'uras as a hischayvus to better ourselves in some way, as a tzibur, as yichidim, and Klal Yisrael b'chol makom are gathering to be ma'or themselves, and we had the schus that it worked out. Yeshiva Madrega Saldom in New York is here, Rabbi Faskowitz, and it's a great schus to have Imam Mitzvah for many decades here, Rav, Yeshiva, and it's a covet to be able to call Rav Epis to give us a little bit of Divrei Hisorerus to be chizuk in the Matzah.
I want to begin, of course, by extending a yasher koach to Rosh Kollel for the invitation. Rabbi Grossman, one of my Talmidim Chavivim, had mentioned to the Rosh Yeshiva be here, and he extended a wonderful opportunity to speak. And I sent a list of Marmakayim. And Marmakayim says he's going to speak about a different topic. We didn't know at the time. And was yesterday, he suggested that maybe we speak about the topic you just mentioned, reflections. I would call reflections on the Meiron and the terrible tragedy that Klal Yisrael had to endure so recently. The first thing I would say is the reaction that we saw in the world, in the Yiddish world, at first was very troubling. They were always troubling. Because the first thing that happens is everybody goes into shock. And then after go into shock, you begin to dust settles and you begin to try and say, I need to understand this. And then by the third day already there's different people that are blaming this one and blaming that one, and everybody points a finger and it's this fault and it's that fault, and everybody figured it out already. And then 4, 5, 6, 7 days go by and they forget about it. So it's interesting how sometimes things of such magnitude, not only can they not have enduring effects on us in a way that it will be a ticking, but sometimes you see a chassaron in the knee-jerk reaction that people have in pointing fingers. Some disturbing people made suggestions that because the Chilonim was published, the Chal Shabbos, and because there's so much Chil Shabbos, so that's why Kibakroy HaKadosh, that's why there were fruma people that were the Korbanos, Chil Shabbos. I can't believe that people will even say something so foolish, so offensive, and think that they're... Look, if the Gadol Hador said so, Chaim Kanievsky came out and said so, then it's like Malach Hashem Tzvokis is Yevakish Torah Mipiyu, he said so, that's the way it is. But anybody less than that has no right to say something that no more than the next day, in response to the one who said that it's because of the Chilon and Chilul Shabbos. So the Jerusalem Post actually put out an article that, you know why this happened? To teach the Haredim a lesson that you have to follow rules. They didn't follow the rules, they didn't follow the regulations, and they start with the masks, how they pick on the Haredim, and they didn't follow the rules in Meiron, and when you don't follow the rules, who is worse? The first one was worse, the second one was worse. Both were foolish, because we don't have the right. We don't have the right to suggest that we know, or we can say why, or point fingers. This is not what we do. I'll tell you what we do. There's two concepts that we have to understand when we face a tragedy of this magnitude. And that is, number one, there's a concept of cause and effect. Where do we find in halacha the union of cause and effect? When I'm holding something in the air, and I take it like this, if I let go, it falls. So this is the cause that I let go. The effect is that this falls. The consequence is that it made a noise. This cause, effect, this consequence. You see, Chassam Sofer, he writes in Parshas Mase, he says, Yichtav Moshe, he says, as moitzehem lemasehem, al pi Hashem. Ve'elu masehem lemoitzehem. That's how the pasuk is written. So Moshe Rabbeinu, he made it that the mases, the travels that Klal Yisrael had, so the travels, they were travels and there were incidents. And the Torah says, but these are the incidents to the travels. What's the daf community? He says like this. Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest advocate of Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael, in the Midbar, they did a lot of Averis in the Midbar. There were a lot of weak moments that they had very weak moments. Why did they have such weak moments? So Moshe Rabbeinu, the big advocate of Klal Yisrael, said, Elam moitzehem, this is the mises that they did. Moitzehem, lemasehem. They did it because they were traveling. You know what that means? You ever go on a trip with the kids in the car in the back? Sometimes at home they're very behaved, but when you go on a long trip with the kids in the back, are they quiet and still and idle and good and fine, or do you hear this one pushes and this one gets upset? Because when you're traveling, when you're on the road, things are difficult. There's trauma, there's difficult, there's hardships. Moshe Rabbeinu said, the things that they did bad is because Hashem Yisborah subjected them to the masses, to the traveling. It's the fault of the traveling, but really they were all good. They were all good not to be responsible. The Torah says, no, ve'elu, and this is masehem lemasehem. The Eibishter made them travel because they did bad things. Not they did bad things because they traveled, but rather the Eibishter made them travel because they did bad things. You have to know what's the cause and what's the effect. Not to get mixed up between the cause and the effect. Same thing in schar and oynish, in incidents that happen. Automatically people see something bad. Is something bad always a punishment? If something bad happens to a person, is it a punishment for something bad he did, or the Eibishter doesn't make a punishment? Or maybe a bad thing is not a punishment necessarily, but it's a consequence. It's not retribution. Sometimes something bad happens, it's not where it's a din of schar v'oynish, but it's a consequence of something that happened. That's understanding deeper cause and effect. Sometimes, again, I repeat over again, something is just a consequence of events, or it's a retribution for a weakness. It's a punishment for something. For example, and this will be the example, we'll know clearly where I'm going with this. Chaim Shmulevitz talks about the union of Ben Adam leChaverei. He says Ben Adam leChaverei is a very interesting union. How chomer it is ma'oid. He says when a person is over, a person fails, he violates the standards of Ben Adam leChaverei, will he be punished? And something bad happens to him, is it a punishment? Is it not necessarily? He said like this. There's a Gemara, the Gemara says Rav Ruchami. Rav Ruchami was a big tzaddik. And Rav Ruchami used to learn a whole year in yeshiva. He used to come back one day, Mal Yom Kippur. He used to come back early in Kippur. And his wife used to wait for him. Big thing came. Once we went to Mispal Ba'adei Ba'adei together, so she would wait. One time, he was learning early in Kippur on the Merpeset, on the porch, up on the balcony, and he got involved in learning. The Pasha forgot. He forgot he has to go home. His wife was waiting, and Shori Shoina, she didn't think of it. Shoshniya, she started to get worried. Shoshlisha, says the Gemara, a tear fell from her eye. And she was crying. She realized that he's not. That moment that the tear fell from her eye, the balcony collapsed and Rav Ruchami died. So Chaim Shmuel says, what's the pshat? The Gemara is trying to tell you that it was an oynish for that he hurt. It's Ben Adam leChaverei. He hurt his wife. Now that's an oynish. This is the oynish that he gets. Doesn't make sense, because who's the one who's the most punished over here? The wife. So it doesn't cheshbon out. He says, what's Chazal trying to tell us? You know what he says? Says something interesting. You should know Bein Adam lechaver is like a fire. It's a very strange thing, Bein Adam lechaver. If I put a candle over here and I put my finger in the candle, what will happen to my finger? He said, it will burn. The finger will burn. Is that an oynish or that's a consequence? It's a consequence, not an oynish. Because one of the things that Hashem made, the teva of the world, is that there's fire, and if you put your hand in the fire burns. It's a teva, he said. It's a consequence. It's not you're punished, you're foolish, but you're not punished, but it's still going to burn, it's going to hurt. Bein Adam lechaver, he says, it's fire. He says, when you hurt somebody, it's not a cheshbon. She's an almona and she's waiting longer and it didn't work out and it doesn't cheshbon. That's not the point. He says, you hurt somebody, you do Bein Adam lechaver, there's a consequence. It's not a... Rav Chami, when he went up to Shemayim, he's not going to be punished. He was oisik b'Torah. He was taught for Mishnosai. He was learning, and it was rightness. He didn't even realize it was Erev Kippur. He's not going to be punished, but the balcony had to fall. He says, you hurt someone, Bein Adam lechaver. The teva of the world is the fire burns. That's called a consequence. It's not necessarily a oynish, but it's the result. It's the extension of cause. You have to know what is a cause, what is an effect, and what is a consequence, not a retribution. Having said that, I would draw your attention to another time in history when they asked this question. And by the way, I will tell you, were you shaken by the fact that so many people died, were nifter, and so many were injured? I think everybody was shaken. This is minuscule to compare to what happened in Meiron in 1835. Parshas Emor, by the way. Look in Chassam Sefer Parshas Emor. In 1835, there was an extraordinary earthquake in the Galil. And the earthquake, Chassam Sefer writes, it killed tens of thousands of Yidden, tens of thousands, and among them thousands of Bnei Torah, Yerei Mushleim Talmidei Chachamim. You have to look at this, he gives the numbers. It was such a tragedy, they want to say, Ama as Hashem Ezois. What was the reason? Everybody was wondering, what was the reason of such a terrible tragedy? Chassam Sefer writes, very interesting thing, in the end he writes that the reason that this happened, because everybody always wants to know the reason. I said before, are we allowed to say the reason? Can any of you have the right to say the reason? It's inappropriate for anybody to give. Chassam Sefer can say a reason. Chassam Sefer, yeah. Kanievsky, yeah. It's on you. See, he said the reason is, he believes, because nobody was, where was everybody living, he says, in those days, in 1835? They were living in Tzvas, in Tveria, in Shechem, in Meiron. That's where they were all living, in the Galil. Who was living in Yerushalayim? Kemat nobody. It was hard to find a minion in Yerushalayim. Nobody wanted to live in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim was off the beaten track. It was a mountain. It was an agrarian culture. They weren't even able to, you can't make fields of produce and rocks. And in those days, it's hard. Yerushalayim was poor and starving. And there, the cities in the Galil, they were on the main road. It would go from Syria and it would come down to Lebanon, it would come down to Gaza, come down to Egypt. It was on the road, and it was more in the mainstream, and people could live. They had to live. Yerushalayim, they were starving. But the Pas HaShulchan and the Talmidei Agra, the ones who made it to Yerushalayim, they started, and especially, he's going to write the Pas HaShulchan, says Rabbi Yisrael, he was a Goyin HaGoyinim, him and Reb Chaim Volozhin, maybe the biggest Talmidei of the Gra. And he writes, he came to Yerushalayim, and he would rail against all the people. Why are you running to Tzfas? Why are you going there to come to Yerushalayim? And actually, he rejuvenated eventually Yerushalayim to a big degree. Says the Chassam Sefer, but you should know, if you think that Yerushalayim stood there quietly and wasn't bothered, you make it, Yerushalayim was angry. Yerushalayim felt scorned, he says. And when Yerushalayim was scorned, it took out its anger on the Galil. And that's why it happened, he says, because Yerushalayim was scorned. Look at me, you see in Emor, take a look in the hesped that he gives on that Kufa, he says the hesped, and he says that's the reason. Then he suggests, Yerushalayim doesn't stand by idly. And he says, Yerushalayim was different. Yerushalayim, first he didn't understand the whole of Shem Baruch. He says himself, there was a big machlokes between him and Ephraim Reuven, or Reuven Ephraim Margolius, that in his time was the Baki Ador, and they had a big machlokes. He held that there was a lot of Makoros, that you go to Meiron and Hilula Durab Shem Baruch. And if someone says, I don't understand Hilula, what's Hilula? He says, Hilula means you celebrate. When's the last time you celebrated someone's death? When's when you celebrate Moshe Rabbeinu's death? We know the day he died. We know the day that Yeshua ben Nun died. We know the day that many people perished and died in their demise. We don't make Hilula. Why Hilula the Reb Shimon? He said, I could have said in Zohar, and it's mentioned very frequently. Yes, he says Hilula means in Shemayim was a Hilula, he writes. In Shemayim they were excited because till now the Heliker of Shimon Bar Yochai was so Helik we can't even begin to, the magnitude of his greatness, especially that he assumed and that he was able to reach after the time, the 12/13 years of the Mara, was so big, so amazing. The Zohar, it's difficult to understand the Zohar that describes the greatness of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The closest to Hashem is Baruch. The Siyur that he gives Moshe Rabbeinu, over, unbelievable. But he says, Afal Pikein, in Shemayim they were happy to have his neshama, so they made a Hilula in Shemayim, they were dancing. Down here when he died, they were crying. You don't make a Hilula. He says, but not everybody agrees with me. He says, they don't have to agree with me, he says. And a lot of people believe in the Hilula. He didn't feel it was appropriate. It doesn't matter. The main thing he says is that when you look at the things that happened in his door, he felt that it was important to recognize that Yerushalayim demanded to be rejuvenated. Yerushalayim wanted the Yishuv, and that's what happened. The Yishuv HaYosher, the old Yishuv, not the new Yishuv, but the old Yishuv, then, I'm not talking about Ramban. When the Ramban came to Yerushalayim, how many did they have in Yerushalayim? Ramban couldn't find a minyan. It wasn't a Sefer Torah kosher in Yerushalayim. Until he brought a Sefer Torah kosher to Yerushalayim and he made a minyan, and he bought a little room that he could make the minyan in. Anybody who was in the old city who went to the Ramban's shul, is the same one. There was nothing in Yerushalayim, was nothing for many years. And it demanded then, the Yerushalayim and Taka was rejuvenated. In a short period of time, Yidden became the Roiv, not the Arabs in Yerushalayim. That's history, it's not important for our discussion now. But what's more important than what he writes is, what he says, that's what I say. But let me tell you what Rabbi Yisrael de Pas HaShulchan says. He says, a lot of people died. They died in Meiron. But he says, let me give you a little nechama, because in the end of Masechta Soita in the Mishnah, it's written that before Mashiach will come, there will be a Ra'odah in the Galil. There'll be an earthquake in the Galil. So though we mourn all the people that died, but we have to lift our eyes to Hashem and say, now you're heralding the coming of Mashiach. Mashiach is coming because this must be the Ra'odah that the Mishnah before taught. He says, this I don't know, because he himself says, who knows to predict such things? He's a Talmud Chacham at the time of the Gra. He wasn't into those, where Cheshbonis and Gematrius and Asidis, and this is for different kind of people, not for the Gra kind of people. So he said there's something else. He says, you should know, it wasn't the only time there was a Churban in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim, there was another Churban, the Churban Habayis. And the Churban Habayis happened, why? Because there was a Sinas Chinam. He says, this earthquake we had, there was no Sinas Chinam. There was no Sinas Chinam, but you know what there was? He says, because the people were all good. He's made on them. These were good people. These people were, actually in those days, they were nice to each other. But lately, over a long period of time, they became not nice. He writes, an interesting notion. They weren't nice to each other anymore. They weren't so nice to each other. Why? Because they were hungry. And when people are hungry, when people are starving, they do things that are not normal. And they were so hungry, he says, and they were so tzebrochen and mentioned in those days, when a person is on that stage of his life, he could be the nicest person in the world, but you become, you know what the word is, tempestuous. You become cantankerous. You become a person that is unable to conduct himself in an appropriate fashion with another person that he's with. And he says, because of that, they weren't so nice to one another. So that's why the Eibishter made this Ra'odah. It wasn't like the Churban that he took everybody and it was Golis, but there had to be a Ra'odah. When people are not nice to each other, there has to be a consequence. Though it's not their fault. He says it wasn't an Einish. You know what I'm telling you? He writes, it wasn't an Einish. They weren't punished. But when people are not nice, there's a consequence. There's just a plain consequence. It's not retribution. They're not schlechte Menschen. They're good people. And when there's good people, the Eibishter is Merachim. And the Midas HaChesed, the Midas HaRachmin can be mal biyad chazok on the Midas Hadin. But there has to be a consequence. And he says this was the consequence. Ayin Sham. You look in the Chasam Sofer, I just say it over, I don't make it up, I say it over. You can interpret it the way you want. So I want to say this. I remember as a young boy in the Mir Yeshiva in 1965, it's a long time ago. And it was a Thursday night, in 1966 actually. Chaim Shmulevitz had just become the Mir Rosh Yeshiva. Rez Yudah was Nifter, and he started to say Shmuz in 1966. And I came there in 65. So the third week I was there, it happened to be Thursday night. We took Chaim in a house, and then I excused myself, and I told the Rosh Yeshiva, I'm a young boy, 16, 17-year-old boy, I said, I have to leave. Chaim says, wie gehst du? I said, I'm in Yeshiva. He said, why are you going to Yeshiva? I understand, what are you going? He said, I'm going for Mishmar. Oh, Mishmar? He says to me Thursday. And what does Mishmar mean? I said, Rosh Yeshiva, what do you mean what is Mishmar? I told him, Mishmar will sein auf eine ganze Nacht, mit lernen bis morgen in der Frike Vesiken, mit Davenen, und dann in sich leben schlafen ein bisschen. So he says, so you're going to go Mishmar? By the way, all of you talk Yiddish, right? Yeah. So Chai says to me, he says, what do you mean Mishmar? He said, be up a whole night. And I learn, and then in the morning I go to Vesiken Davenen. No. He said, I don't believe in that. I said, well, I don't believe it. He says, because if you do that, you're up a whole night Mishmar. So what's going to happen tomorrow? You're going to daven kivasikin, and then it's Friday. What are you going to do Friday? It's to schlafen. He says, Moshe, Friday's eichettatag. Friday's also a day. Where does it in the Torah Friday you don't learn? Regular day learning. Who made the new rule? Friday's not a day. No, he says, I don't believe in Mishmar. What I tell you is Thursday, every night till when do you learn? 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. I didn't answer it. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. He says, you learn how much you learn every night, Thursday night. You'll get up in the morning, you'll come to yeshiva davening like you come over morning. And Friday is to learn, and Friday you'll learn the whole day like you're supposed to. And you want to step a whole night Friday night. Because Shabbos, Shabbos Shlafman, Shabbos you go eat by somebody. Shabbos is not a regular day in yeshiva, so you didn't lose a day in yeshiva. You don't lose a day in yeshiva. So I remember I was very surprised because Mishmar is a very popular thing. I said to him, let me tell you, he says about himself. So I want you to know, I had a chavrusa. He told me when he was in the Mir. And I had a chavrusa, and I used to learn with this chavrusa every night, and he said that until 2 o'clock at night we used to learn, then we used to go to sleep. It was the night before Shivasa B'Tammuz, and my chavrusa says to me, he says, you know what? He says, let's learn a couple more hours, 3 more hours, and we'll get up to the Sikkim, we'll daven early, and it's a Tanis tomorrow, and this way we can go to sleep, and we'll sleep through much of the Tanis. I says, no. He says, I'm going to sleep. He says, regular time. Okay. So the chavrusa stayed up the whole night, and he went to the Sikkim. Next day was Shivasa B'Tammuz. His chavrusa slept through the whole day. The Chaim Shmulevitz went to sleep at regular time. He got up the next morning, and it was the day of the Tanis. What did he do the day of the Tanis? He learned the whole day. At the end of the Tanis, they were sitting together, and he says, how did the Tanis go by you? The guy said, geschlafen the ganze Tag. I slept the whole day. And so I said, see, you slept the whole day, I learned the whole day. You stayed up at night, and you didn't learn the next day. Tanis, he says, is also a day. It's like he says, Friday. Who told you Friday is not a day? And Eretz Yisrael, Friday somehow became a minig Yisrael. Friday was the day. He says, and a Tanis is not a day. He said, I learned another day. That's a story that was, I remember personally. HaRav Chaim wanted to emphasize to me, Bittul Torah from a day, from an hour, from a moment. He was emphasizing, the attitude towards Bittul Torah. This is how I tell you that I remember. That was 1965. 1966. It was It was before Lag B'Omer. Got up in front of the yeshiva. I remember he said a shmuz, and then he said like this: Rabbi Side, I want you to know that I strongly urge and advise everybody. I wish I could say in Yiddish it comes out so much better, but I'm telling all of you not to go to Meiron. You can't go to Meiron. I don't want you to go to Meiron. You stay in yeshiva, I don't want you to go to Meiron. And I want you to know that if you do go to Meiron, and I find out, and you return, and then you come back to me, and you ask me if you can come back into the yeshiva, I will say to you, yes, of course you can come back, but I will not be happy. Never forget how he said it. We're all waiting for him to say, no one can come back. And they say that. He said, of course I will tell you, come back to yeshiva. But remember, I will not be happy. He says, 1 day, 2 days, is eichet atog. It's also a day. Where steht in the Torah those are days that we don't learn? Who gave the permission anybody to say to close the Gemara? Klal Yisrael should close the Gemara, but the Torah should close the Gemara. Who gave them such permission? Who gave such permission? And he said over from Rabbi Yitzchak Petterberger, famous Gemara in Yuma. The Gemara says that Lo said Lavoi Lachem Evesim Semle Goldamala. So they asked the first question of Sasav and Sasav Be'emuna, and right away they asked the same time Loma Lo Yasakta B'Torah. He used to say it over. You'll be standing there alone, and they're going to ask you one question. Favos ist nicht gelernt. What about your Bittul Torah? You didn't learn. What's Bittul Torah? Where's the Bittul Torah? Answer me. So what's the famous answer that everybody will give? First one will say is, Ani, I was poor. I was too poor. I had to struggle for Parnas. I was poor. They'll ask you, Ani, Hayisa Hillel? Were you an Ani like Hillel? Oh, no. That's not a terrorist, you're poor. No, the other guy said, I got a terrorist. What's your terrorist? I was too wealthy. I had so much money, and the Eibishter gave me some marble, I had big responsibilities, and therefore I couldn't learn. I was too busy. You were as rich as Rav Lozer Reb Charsom. And Lozer Reb Charsom had in Medina Sayyam, and he had islands, and he had money, and merchant, and everything. And he learned, and then the next one is going to come. He said, Rabbi Shalom, you can't blame me for not learning Torah Hosi B'Yitzra. I had a Yetzirah. Yetzirah? What do you mean you had a Yetzirah? Yeah, I was right of notion. Pardon me. It's a ridiculous notion. I was a ganef. I had to go. I had an obsession with stealing. I was a ganef. What were you? I was a Samarba Machlekes B'Yisrael. I like Machlekes. I had a Yetzirah. What could I do? I had a Yetzirah. Yetzirah overwhelmed me. There's nothing I could do. I had a Yetzirah. So then the Gemara says, they'll say, you had a Yetzirah, you think that's a terrorist. Your Yetzirah was bigger than Yosef's Yetzirah. Yosef HaTzadik had a Yetzirah too. We all know that Eshes Poitiferet tried to seduce him, and she tried to convince him Lachtoi to do a chet, and he didn't succumb to his Yetzirah. So that's all, and yet he remained a tzaddik and remained true to his learning. We see later with the Agolis. So you see that that's the Torah. Yitzhak is not a terrorist. So Rabbi Yitzchak, I don't understand. He says, here's the kasha. The first two guys, they said a good terrorist. They said, I'm poor, I'm rich. That's a terrorist. The third guy that he said, I had a Yetzirah. You had a Yetzirah, I mean, you're schmeißen. Of course, what are we going to do? You had a Yetzirah. You did a virus, you had Tivus. You did a virus, you had Gedavis. You know what? We'll take in Gehenna mit der Schmeißen. And what they're going to do is they're going to give you a pulse in the Nura. And they're going to give you all kinds of ocean. So what kind of terrorist is that? He says, you know what? So you'll come in the other world, and you'll see what it is, Bittul Torah. You'll understand when you come there the magnitude of the Aveira of being Mevatel Torah, pardon me, for 1 minute to be Mevatel Torah. You'll see how disgusting that is. How you are flying in the face of the biggest matana Rabbeinu Shalom gave us, and the Kofui Tov in every fashion. Bittul Torah, you'll see how big Bittul Torah is. You'll say, you know what, beat me, schmeiß me, give me oinshin for every Aveira, just please don't punish me for Bittul Torah. Not for Bittul Torah. But 1 day learning is also day learning. 2 days learning is also, and when you don't learn one day, B'nai Torah, and when whole yeshivas close, and there's Bittul Torah, it's not ancient because they all did a mitzvah. Everyone who went, they went b'pkudas their Rebbe, they went b'pkudas a Rebbe, they went b'pkudas Gedolei Yisrael, and I'm not Chalila pointing a finger in any way and in any way diminishing their good intent. And there was no punishment. It's not retribution. You have to know cause and effect. But let me tell you, my good friends, there is consequence for Bittul Torah. When there's a lot of Bittul Torah, there's consequence. And I don't know what the reason, like the Pasha Shulchan Aruch, the Chassam Sofer said that such a tragedy can befall Am Yisrael. But like Moshe said now, the first thing and the major thing we have to do is we have to be boichen leiv, and we have to understand the Eibishter is talking to us. I think that's the word he used. The Eibishter says, what is the Eibishter telling us? One thing I know for sure the Eibishter is telling us: no Bittul Torah. If you come back to the yeshiva, I'll take you, but I won't be happy. But I won't be happy. And every single younger man, especially the younger light in yeshiva, has to be mechazik himself. Rav Chaim used to say, Chaim Shulevitz, when he said this over so beautifully, he said, and with this I conclude, what's the biggest Yetzer Hara a person has? He says the story of Paltiel ben Laish. Paltiel ben Laish was the person that Shaul HaMelech, he put into the Mita together with Michal Bashol to degrade David HaMelech, and there would be no chet because the marriage was a no. There's whole pshat and why it wouldn't have been a chet. But Paltiel ben Laish, who was in the bed with Michal Bashol, he didn't want to Chalila be tempted to do a chet. So what he did was, he says, Noatz cherav beino lebeino. He took a sharp sword, the noitz, and he put the cherav beino lebeino. Chaz b'sholem, he shouldn't succumb to his Yetzer Hara. So Reb Chaim said, you know what that means? That imagine the younger man in yeshiva. Imagine all the younger light, he said, in our yeshiva. They sit hours with a Gemara. And every single second, there's a Yetzer Hara that is by the Beis Medrash, the Pesach Chatas Roivitz. He's standing right there waiting. Somebody walk over. Let me ask you, how was today? By the way, I didn't see you. You're going to give me a ride later on? In the middle of learning. What do you mean? I said, what you asked me? I'm literally sitting and learning my chavrusa, and you say, excuse me, just 1 minute. I want to know, could you return to me later? Or my wife is going. Are you going to be able to go shopping? Okay, I didn't want to bother you. What is that? We are, he said, the B'nai Torah, we are in the Mita with the Yetzer Hara, he would say. The Yetzer Hara from Bittul Torah. Every second, it's not just a day of learning, and not an hour of learning, it's a moment of learning. One moment of learning that we're mafsid, that's my point, there are consequences. And the Eibishter is zufrieden. And we take Torah Seina HaKadoshah and we fritter away moments even of learning. The consequences. Because the learning what we do has enormous. Imagine if for bad consequences, how we keep the Torah world alive, how we keep the non-Torah world alive, the Yiddish world alive. What do you think we're all alive from? I think we're all alive from the learning, from the learning Torah. That's the source of all Chayim Keim Chayim V'Erechemenu. That, what I say, would be the reflection that I think I have, considering what the Chassam Sofer said, considering what the Pasha Shulchan said, considering that we're not allowed to say, I think, that other things, and it's a cause, and there's a consequence, and Meiron in and of itself, I think there will be a lot of exploring, and a lot of cheshbon nefesh that many people will make next year, and I think you will see that a lot of people will make, yes, we will observe the Hilula de Reb Shimon in a halakha fashion, in a beautiful fashion, with all the kavod and everything that it deserves and it must receive. But I think that primary is the commitment that we make to Hasmoda in a way that we never had before. Storim should not be interrupted. Yugalite should not come late. Yugalite should not leave yeshiva early. And in the middle of Storim, no one has the right to interfere with a Seder. That's a real commitment to learning. And if that's what we can do, I can assure everybody the consequences will be what the Pasuk Shulchan said. That's what will bring the Mashiach quickly. And that will be, right now, this will be the announcement almost. The Ikvus of the Mashiach will hear that he's on his way, because Klal Yisrael finally has reached that pinnacle of Matan Torah, B'Hasina Yom Asher U'Maltu Lifnei Hashem Lekecha B'Chayr.